And through that experience, I was transported to a completely different universe, it felt like. Saw many different versions of myself, future versions, past versions, younger versions. And through that experience, I was able to, kind of tap into this free modality, as you describe it, and realize that, oh my God, this is just as powerful and powerful in perhaps even a different way than plant medicines can be. And it's freely available to all of us.
Welcome, Tribe. I'm Maya Rose.
And I'm Gerald Rogers. We're about to embark on another mind-expanding episode where we dive deep into the realms of psychedelics, sex, and the superconscious.
This is a transformational experience of healing, manifestation, increased clarity, flow, and alignment.
So join us on this sacred journey as we receive the codes of transformation from scientists and psychonauts, shamans, tantra masters, mystics, and more.
Together, we'll unravel the secrets of plant medicine, sex magic, and other tools to tap into higher states of consciousness.
So why are we here? To answer the call, to share our passions and be advocates for alternative healing.
So get ready for a ride that transcends the ordinary and leads you to the extraordinary, because living a legendary life is not just a choice.
It's a sacred adventure. Welcome back, soul family. I am here with Sachin Patel, and we're going to have a deep soul conversation. I'm so grateful to have you here. Sachin is a clinical physician, does a lot of holistic medicine. He works with practitioners, training practitioners, and then also does his own clinical stuff. Before we jump into it, Sachin, I have this game that I like to play, and I call it the question game. And I have 52 different questions that'll give me a glimpse into someone's soul. So I'm going to have you pick a random number between 1 and 52. What's the number?
All right, 18.
18. All right, here's the question. How do you imagine the world will be different 20 years from now? This is perfect based on what we were just talking about before we started this recording. But give me your perspective of the future and how the world will be different 20 years from now.
Great question. I think from my perspective, I think the world is going to be a wonderful place to live. Just to give context, we were talking about cloning myself using AI, and just so many things are going to be streamlined. So many efficiencies are going to take place for us, which I hope allows us to engage in nature more. I hope it gets us gets us away from being in front of our screens. And the future that I love to see happen is where there is more green time and less screen time. And I feel like we're moving in that direction. If we can have the robots and the computers do some of the mundane tasks and take ourselves out of that equation, we can go back to being, ironically, we can go back to being human again. So that's the future I'd love to see and live into.
I love hearing that. And there's you get such an interesting view into someone's soul by how they imagine the future. Because obviously there's some people that are terrified. Some people are gloom and doom. Some people are we're going to destroy the world and, global warming and, AI is going to, take over and we're all going to become slaves. That's what some people's perspective is. And then there's people like you who really, almost have this utopian perspective. One of my mentors, my brother actually worked extensively with this ancient Indian doctor who carried this really special codes. And anyways, he would always talk about the difference between being young versus old. And he would say, you can be 20 years old or 80 years young. It doesn't have anything to do with how many years you've been on the planet. Someone who is old is rigid and stiff in their body, their mind, and their spirit. And they tend to look towards the future as being worse than the past. Versus someone that is young is flexible in body, in mind, and spirit. And they tend to have a perspective of the future where things are going to get better. And I really love that perspective. And I think that probably, as you've spent so much time in the world of healing and helping people navigate all sorts of, different things, I'm sure that's a really relevant conversation that you've had. It's why do some people age so early and experience so much pain and go through so much versus, those that tend to live a very positive, upbeat life, no matter how many chronological years that they've had. I'm curious about your perspective, just because I know you've spent so much time, dealing with people's physical bodies as well as a holistic experience. What do you feel like are the biggest elements that keep someone feeling young and experiencing health and vitality and joy and optimism throughout their life?
Another great question. I think a big thing is who we surround ourselves with. So community is everything. My friend James Pascal wrote a book called The Community Cure. And if we surround ourselves with positive, uplifting, upbeat individuals, then guess what? It has a tendency to rub off on us. Or if we're that person, we have a tendency to rub off on other people. I think another thing that keeps us young is playing. So having fun, doing things that we enjoy, and moving our bodies in nature as much as we can. And I love learning from children. So a lot of people, they're constantly trying to teach their kids what to do, but I like to sit back and actually enjoy what my son can teach me. And what kids teach us is to play, to forgive, to not take life so seriously and be flexible instead of being so rigid. So I think those are two key elements: is what can you learn from your community and who can you surround yourself with, and what can you learn from your children? Because to me, my son has been my greatest teacher so far.
I experienced that same thing as a father, like really shifting the paradigm from me being the one that's supposed to teach them. And I understand my role. I understand what I'm here to do to support them in adulting and growing up. I understand that, but I find that job so much easier when I can stay in curiosity with them, when I can get a perspective of their world, when I can listen more and actually feel the depth of who they are at a soul level. How old's your son again?
He's turning 14 in August. Wow. So barely a teenager.
Yeah, I've got a 14-year-old too. It's actually he just turned 15. They grow up so fast, and it's amazing. Mm-hmm. How has being a parent changed your outlook on the future? How has being a parent cultivated your vision for both who you want to be in the future that you want to help create?
Yeah, one of the things I've learned is that we essentially model through our behaviors, we model who our children become. They don't pay attention to what we say and tell them to do. They pay attention to what we actually do. And having a child has held me to a higher standard because I realize the ripple effect of all the decisions I make, all the actions I take, all the words that I say can carry on into the future through him. And, being a father of an only child, I want to make sure that I take this one opportunity to be the best version of myself, but also teach him how to be the best version of himself from what I can model to him. And I'm also trying to co-create a better world, So another vision that I have for the future is not a world where people get sick and then they get sicker and sicker and sicker and finally find someone who can help them be healthy. The world I'd love to create is a world where people are healthy from the very beginning. So instead of waiting until somebody is 50 and has cancer, then learning how to live healthy, what if we could model that from the very beginning into people's lives? Like my son, for example, he's our client number 0, if you will. He doesn't have a pediatrician, doesn't have a family doctor. He's never been unwell. And so we know what's possible for a human being when they're provided with the right environment for them to thrive in. And I just want that for as many kids as possible. But ultimately, it starts with the parents. It starts with the parents being the best version of themselves and then modeling that to their children. Because our current healthcare crisis doesn't need more doctors and more nurses and more holistic practitioners to solve the crisis. It needs more healthy people. So then the question becomes, how do we create more healthy people? And it's not by waiting until they get sick and then restoring their health. It really is about teaching them from the very beginning how to be healthy so that they can live an entirely different life if they choose to.
I think it's such a relevant question in terms of what is it that cultivates those healthy people? What are the things, let's just imagine, you could broadcast to the world your formula that you think that would be most valuable for humans to adopt as their pathway to living more healthy lives in the most simplest way. without getting overcomplicated? Like what would be the most valuable and important recipe to give to people listening here, but to the whole planet, to say, hey, this is how we emerge as the healthiest versions of ourselves? What would be your formula?
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story, which will drive this point home. So a few years ago in 2018, my wife and I went to India, and here we are on our functional medicine high horse. And we were like, you know what, let's see how much of this we can bring to India to help our family members and help people that we meet along the way. And we just had a good laugh as we were driving past a group of really very impoverished individuals. And I looked at my wife and I'm like, look at that. They're doing all the things we tell our clients to do. They're spending most of their time outdoors. They're barefoot with the earth. So they're collecting all these electrons. They don't have a refrigerator, so they're eating fresh foods. They gather in community every night with their family, happy as you can imagine. And they don't have artificial lighting. So they surround themselves by a fire or candlelight, and they're physically active throughout the day. And so the poorest people in one of the poorest countries are doing all the things that we're trying to convince our well-to-do clients to do. And it was just the biggest irony, because most of the diseases and illnesses that people have these days are illnesses of modern life, right? We're sedentary. We're staring at computer screens. We're bathing in blue light. We're not connecting with nature. So our circadian rhythm gets thrown off.
Stressed. They're just constantly taking on stress and holding it in their body.
Yeah, they have no way of releasing it either. So it's just, we think way too much about the future and way too much about the past. And I think the thing that makes us human and can humanize us even further is being more present. So I love spending more time outside. That brings me into the present moment. I love playing. That brings me into the present moment. And I love having, encouraging people to find a way to release whatever stress builds up, whether that's through breath work, whether that's through exercise, whether that's through grounding, whatever that is, a hobby that they can pursue, just finding ways to be more themselves and live in congruency with what their body requires.
I think that's amazing. I had an interesting experience also similar to yours, where back in, I think it was 2014, there was this devastating earthquake that hit Kathmandu, Nepal. And my brother had been serving at this orphanage there and been visiting, and he'd always bring back pictures of this amazing group of kids. And so I kind of felt like this tie to this orphanage. And I got a call from my brother saying, Gerald, I have some terrible news. The orphanage was destroyed in the earthquake. All the kids are fine, but they don't have a place to live. They're just living in a makeshift tent. We have to do something. And so what was beautiful is we put out a call to our community and our friends, and we hosted this little fundraiser, and we had people donate over $35,000, $40,000, to this group of kids on the other side of the world that they would never meet. And it was really beautiful to feel the generosity that humans have when they come together and they see a need. It was really touching for me. But my brother and I had an opportunity to go over there and to bring this aid to them and see how we could serve them. And I remember having that experience where I thought I was I'm this American, and I have all these answers, and I'm here to go serve these poor, unfortunate kids. And I had that Western egoic idea of what I was here to bring to help these poor, unfortunates. There was this really strong ego in me that was in some ways really genuine. I just wanted to serve. I just wanted to help. But what I wasn't prepared for is how much I would receive. And I remember walking up this dirt pathway and going and opening the gates of this orphanage. And the orphanage is just a pile of rubble. And there's this makeshift tent. But the moment we walked in, these 35 kids just come rushing at us, and they just jump on us and are hugging us and laughing. And for the next week, as I was with them, they taught me more about love. They taught me more about kindness. They taught me more about happiness than I had ever learned from anyone else. Like they were genuinely my gurus. And here they were with almost nothing, but they were the richest, happiest souls I'd ever encountered, because like you said, they just played outside all day. They had this amazing, with 35 kids, like this big vital family where there was just so much love and care and concern. And, they were eating food that they were growing in their garden. And there was just like, they didn't have phones. They didn't even really have electricity. And so they were just like so connected to the earth in this like very beautiful way. And like, it made me really think, it's like, oh my gosh, like, what do I have to teach these people? Do I actually want them to think that success is meant on pursuing wealth and getting a job and getting educated so that they could go acquire more stuff? Is that actually what would really serve them? Do I want to get them computers and things to like have them like focus on? Like, it was like this really interesting thing where it just shifted my whole paradigm of what the recipe for happiness really is. And it also had me coming back to my like very materialistic life in America. Is like, shit, why do I own all of this stuff? And I wish I could say that it's stuck and that I could say I was still living a minimalist lifestyle. I'm like, I'm very much sucked back into like, the Western experience of doing and being and creating and owning stuff, right? But it's every once in a while when I think about those kids, I'm like, oh, I just need to simplify, because I think simplification is like one of the ingredients for health. So I really appreciate that perspective. I want to talk right now about one of the simplest forms of activating health and one of the most inexpensive ways we can experience higher states of consciousness. This whole podcast is about how do we access higher states of consciousness? And of course, we talk about psychedelics. Of course, we talk about sex, magic, and orgasms. But what I'm really fascinated to talk about you with is the power of breath. And the power of breath as an access point to higher versions of ourselves, and how through this free medium of our prana, our life force energy, our breath, we can experience more vitality, healing, energy. And I know this is something you've gone really deep with. So back us up in your world a little bit and talk about how you discovered breathwork in your life, why it made such an impact, and tune us into like what you would want people that are curious about how to be more intentional with their breathwork, like what you would teach them. But rewind us back. How did this journey begin for you?
Well, thanks for asking. My journey actually started when one of my mentors, who had also taken me on a plant medicine journey a few years prior to that, invited me to participate in a breathwork experience. And through that experience, I was transported to a completely different universe, it felt like. Saw many different versions of myself, future versions, past versions, younger versions. And through that experience, I was able to, kind of tap into this free modality, as you describe it, and realize that, oh my God, this is just as powerful and powerful in perhaps even a different way than plant medicines can be. And it's freely available to all of us. So I went through several different breathwork experiences, and I finally decided I need to be able to offer this to other people, because as I went down the breathing rabbit hole, I've learned Wim Hof method. I've learned breathwork directly from James Nestor and his students. I've learned breathwork from The Art of Living and also from Giovanni through the Elemental Rhythm breathwork experience. And as a clinician, I started scratching my head and I was wondering, why do more people not know about this? Why do more clinicians not know about this? Why do more patients not know about this? So then I started incorporating it into our clinical practice, but also into our live events, which we would host for practitioners. And it was literally their favorite part of the entire event was breathing. Aside from all the amazing things that they learned, the feedback that we would get over and over again, which was about the breathing. And what they loved about it is they got to meet themselves, many of them for the first time. And they got to take themselves through an experience. Of course, they were coached through it, but they got to generate the experience instead of an outside force generating that experience for them, like a plant medicine. And so it became, a rabbit hole that I went down, and I learned so many different things in that rabbit hole. So one is I learned about how we breathe affects our facial structure. So the positioning of our tongue ultimately changes the shape of our face. And that was very key and crucial because if we, so the positioning of our tongue, which should be in the roof of our mouth, actually allows our face and upper palate to expand correctly, which allows for a nice open airway. Many times, if people aren't coached correctly, especially young children, their tongue sits in the bottom of their mouth. And what this does is it creates a narrow airway and causes them to be more likely to be mouth breathers. And people who are mouth breathers are more likely to have their adenoids removed, more likely to have their tonsils removed, and they're also more likely to have a smaller airway because their airway and their face kind of collapse inward. When the tongue is positioned correctly, it pushes everything outwards. And it also allows them to have a nice wide bite, which is crucial for their dental health as well. And this journey, actually, for me, there was multiple dimensions that pulled me into this area. So one, when my son went to the dentist for the first time, he had a whole bunch of cavities, and my wife and I were left kind of scratching our heads because he eats a really healthy diet and he doesn't eat sugar and junk food and things like that. And what we realized and learned later on is the number one cause of cavities is actually mouth breathing. And so he was a habitual mouth breather. And of course, our kids are not around us all the time. They're at school and things like that. So we don't always know how they're breathing. And when they're sleeping, we may not be paying attention to how they're breathing. But because he was a mouth breather, he had a bunch of cavities. But also because he was a mouth breather, his tongue being in the bottom of his mouth, his upper palate was overcrowded. So every dentist we went to, it took us 4 dentists until we found the right one. They all wanted to pull his teeth. They said his teeth are overcrowded, and so we're going to have to pull them. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense because I don't think we're born with too many teeth. I think we probably have a small jaw. And that's when I learned about James Nestor's work. And that's where I started learning how our tongue positioning changes our facial structure, changes our airway, changes our immune system, and it affects so many different parts of our health. So that was one thing with my son. And so we ended up finding a 4th dentist. And for anyone listening to this, if you have young children or even yourself have breathing issues, you want to find an airway-focused dentist. You can go to askthedentist.com and you can find a dentist that doesn't just look at your bright smile, but also looks at your facial structure and takes that into consideration when making dental recommendations. And so that's what we did with my son. We expanded his palate, didn't have to have any teeth pulled.
You say you
and he's got a
expanded his
nice,
palate.
bright,
Was
beautiful
that just
smile.
through reorienting his tongue position and training him how to do that? Or did you have it like medically? Like, I don't know, like what was your process?
Yeah, great question. So we actually had a dental appliance installed because you can do it with your tongue. So you can do mewing exercises and a bunch of different exercises, but you'd have to constantly be doing them. Whereas the palatal expander is working kind of 24/7, even while he's sleeping, to expand that palate out. So it's a little bit more, it's not painful, but it's a little bit more aggressive. So it allows that expansion to take place much faster.
That is like so fascinating. I've never heard people talk about this before. Like tongue position, it feels like such a basic thing that like, oh, it's just like, this is something that feels like it has such an incredible way to impact your life, but I've never heard of this, And so I love that awareness. So it's basically just keeping your tongue towards the top of your roof, and the roof of your mouth, and breathing.
Yep. So the tip of your tongue just behind your front 2 teeth, and then the rest of your tongue just across the roof of your mouth. And then, it's really fascinating because if your tongue is in that position, it's impossible to breathe through your mouth. So it seals your mouth, and that causes us to breathe through our nose. And breathing through our nose is actually so important from a health standpoint that it's almost criminal that people don't know this. So as I started learning this, I just started like it just started literally, no pun intended, blowing my mind that nobody taught me any of this through all the schooling and all the training and all the extracurricular stuff that I've learned. Nobody ever talked about the anatomy and the physiology of breathing and how important it is. So when your tongue is positioned correctly, we breathe through our nose. Breathing through our nose is vital because it pressurizes the air, moisture regulates the air, temperature regulates the air, and it slows down the air. And the importance of that is that our immune system actually starts in our nose. So our nose is lined with a mucosal membrane, which is part of our immune system, which cleanses the air as it enters into our body. Our mouth, on the other hand, is the dirtiest part of our body. So every breath we take in through our mouth actually makes the air dirtier. No matter what the outdoor air quality is, it always gets dirtier when you breathe through your mouth, whereas it gets cleaner when you breathe through your nose. And so you kill pathogens, viruses, bacteria on contact when the air makes contact with your nasal mucosa, because you make something called nitric oxide in your nose. Nitric oxide also helps lower blood pressure, and it helps increase circulation, and it kills pathogens. So you have this like perfectly situated and crafted organ. It's very intricate and very detailed, that's designed to help you extract more oxygen out of the air, but also cleanse the air and purify it before it comes into the body.
So fascinating. So let's talk about some other core benefits of like intentional breathing and breath work, and what that looks like as a practice for both physical and spiritual evolution and activating our superconscious. And then I want to talk about what that looks like on a daily basis outside of like the big intense breathwork experiences. So let's first talk about like the benefits of breathwork and how that can help us to activate higher levels of consciousness and healing and well-being inside of ourselves.
Yeah, so breathwork can be very powerful, and it's important to note that the one of the most important muscles that we never really talk about is the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is known as the second heart. So it's responsible for assisting our heart in pumping blood. But it has three main functions that it's responsible for, and many others, I'm sure. But one is that it assists the heart. So our heart literally sits on our diaphragm, which every breath we take, the diaphragm is helping the heart pump its blood. Every breath we take, our heart is also getting squeezed by the lungs. So we have this mechanical assistance of pumping the heart by simply breathing correctly. The biggest lymph nodes in our body are also underneath our diaphragm. So every time we breathe correct, especially if we're breathing correctly, then we're going to pump our lymphatic system, which is where our body's sewage system is. And so every day we make about 12 liters of lymph, and most of that lymph in our trunk organs doesn't move correctly or flow correctly unless we're breathing correctly. And then the third system that the diaphragm is responsible for is the myofascial system. The myofascial system is like a spandex suit that wraps around every cell, organ, and tissue in our body, connects to every cell nucleus. So every part of our body is simultaneously connected to each other through this hydrostatic system. So it maintains constant pressure thanks to the diaphragm. So we have three key circulatory systems that the diaphragm is responsible for contributing and pumping and supporting, that often gets overlooked. The diaphragm is also very heavily innervated by the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is cranial nerve number 10, probably one of the most important nerves in our bodies, and it's used to do a variety of things, control all of our trunk organs, but it's a two-way communication. So we can change the way we breathe to send a message to our brain to actually change the way we feel. And so what's really fascinating about our bodies is our nervous system uses the breath in order to change our emotional and chemical state. So for example, if you have a lion walk into your room, the first thing you're probably going to do is gasp, right? You don't even know you're going to do it, but you're just going to do it, because what that immediately does is it gets the heart pumping. When you feel a sense of relief, what do? You sigh, right? You don't even realize you're doing it. But these are breathing signatures that our nervous system is telling our diaphragm to breathe this way to elicit an emotional and physical and biological response. but it's a two-way street. So I can change the way I breathe, and then it'll change the way I feel, or I can change the way I feel through outside forces, and it'll change my breath. So the breath is actually one of the first things to change when somebody's state is starting to change. So if somebody's stressed out, their breath is going to change first. If somebody is in fight or flight, their breath is going to change first. If they're feeling a sense of relief, their breath is going to change first. If something's funny, what's the first thing we do? We start laughing, right? Our diaphragm goes into a little mini spasm, right? And that changes our chemistry. If somebody's crying, that's a form of breath work, right? So our diaphragm is almost like a drum, if you will. So we can beat that drum a certain way to create a certain type of music in our body. And so our breath, I refer to the breath as the steering wheel of the nervous system, which means we can alter the way we breathe to alter the state that we're in. Our diaphragm is also where we store a lot of trauma. So it's not uncommon for people who've had traumatic experiences to have a lot of trigger points in their diaphragm. And when they start doing very intentional and intensive breathing practices, like the elemental rhythm or Wim Hof or other modalities that are out there, they will start releasing some of that trauma, because that's where that trauma has been stored in their diaphragm. And for those that don't know this, the lungs are where we store grief. So trauma and grief are very deeply connected to our lungs and our diaphragm. And this is why breathwork practices, especially very intense and intentional breathwork practices, can help us release a lot of this trauma that we've been holding on to for many, many years. Sometimes for people, their entire lifetime, they've been holding on to it and not realizing it.
So many times in breathwork sessions, either at our events or that I've attended, where in the midst of like really intense breathwork experience, someone just has like deep cathartic release and they start bawling and crying, and like it just like erupts out of them, and then they just feel something like somatically shift and heal inside of them because of that. And I've never actually heard that that's where grief and other traumas is stored, but it makes sense just because I've seen it so many times where people they're not even trying to release that trauma. They're not like attempting to approach through their brain and as a strategy, but it just happens because they're engaging and moving the energy, and they're somatically like tapping into that part where it's stored. And it's like so beautiful to see the healing that happens, both emotional and physical healing that happens when people do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens is when people are doing an intense breath work, they have what's called transient hypofrontality. So less blood flow going to the cortex or the neocortex of the brain. And now we start getting more into our feelings. See, a lot of people, they bury their feelings with thoughts, right? They try to think through their feelings instead of feel through their feelings. So when we can shut that part of the brain off through these intense breathing practices, now we can get into our feelings and we can finish crying that cry that we couldn't finish, right? So a lot of times when children are young and they're crying, what do their parents do? They tell them to stop crying. But the way we release the emotion is actually through the crying. It's a form of emotional release. So if we're told to stop crying, then we bury that back down. And what's the muscle that has to stop working in order for us to stop crying? It's our diaphragm.
I love that insight for
right. So then
in raising kids, but also for us as adults. Like it's so funny that there'd be like shame around crying. It's like obviously it's part of the healing process, and the moment you block that or shut that off, it's like putting a dam that locks those emotions inside of us. And I think there's so much healing in crying, and I think especially for us men, there's like this stigma against crying, which is one of the reasons, honestly, like why I love plant medicine, is because it like breaks down all those barriers of like, hey, it's not okay to feel like these really deep emotions. And it just like breaks that dam down. It's like, hey, dude, it's just time to feel, right? It's time to, and one of the things I often say is you can't heal that which you're unwilling to feel. And I think that's such an important reminder. You can't heal what you're unwilling to feel. It's the feeling that allows the emotion to alchemize inside of us so that something healthier can emerge.
Yeah, and I think we're just so we try to over intellectualize things, and we forget that we have feelings and we have emotions that need to be tended to. So I think it's important for parents, right, and even adults to recognize this. I mean, sometimes we need a good cry, and the breath can help us get out of that part of our head so that we can feel instead of try to think our way out of a problem.
Yeah, that's some really good medicine right there. So let's talk about like breathing on a day-to-day basis. How do you integrate this into the experience of life? And how often would you recommend someone to do like a really deep, intense breathwork experience? And what does it look like on a average everyday experience in terms of just being more aware of breath and this energy?
Yeah, I would say there's really no overdoing breath work.
You can't breathe
so
too much, huh?
some of us have a lot to well, you can breathe too much. Most people actually overbreathe. But with breath work, it just depends on how many layers people need to unpack. Just like plant medicines, I feel like the way I refer to breath work is I refer to breath work like taking the stairs, and plant medicine is like taking the elevator. So if you kind of equate the top of the mountain, then there's just different ways that we can get there. And there's people that do holotropic breathing. There's people that do the elemental breathing. There's people that do various different styles of breathing techniques. And they're all trying to get to that same place, to that higher version of themselves. And so I would say that, once a week to once a month, or even once a quarter, depending on the individual, depending on what they need. And sometimes people might start with a higher frequency, and they might feel that once they've released some of these things that they're holding on to, they don't need it as often. In terms of breathing from a day-to-day perspective, I mean, that's where I spend most of my time, is teaching people how to breathe. It sounds so almost like embarrassingly simple, but it is. And so first things first is a couple things for people to note. The slower you breathe, the longer you live. So if you study animals in nature, the ones that breathe the slowest live the longest. A turtle breathes about 3 times a minute, lives about 200 years. A dog breathes 35 breaths a minute and ages 7 times faster. The average human breathes about 15 to 20 times per minute. We only really need to breathe about 6 times per minute. So what I encourage people to do is focus on slowing down their breath. Tongue at the roof of their mouth, breathing in and out through their nose. And what's important to note is your breath should be inaudible. So the person sitting next to you shouldn't even realize you're breathing. So your breathing should be slow and steady. We only breathe in about 500 milliliters with each breath. Our lung capacity is much higher than that, but we don't have to take these deep breaths with every breath we take. It's slow, steady, rhythmic breathing that's important. So 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, in through the nose, out through the nose. That's what we call coherence breathing. That should be the default breathing state. So, Gerald, as you're sitting there, as I'm speaking, you would want to go into your default state of 6 in, 6 out. Could be 5 in, 5 out, could be 7, depending on the person. And that's going to get you into a state of coherence where your heart and your brain are deeply connected. And that's a state we want to be in as much as we can. So when we're sitting, reading a book, when we're checking our email, when we're having a conversation with somebody, how we breathe holds space for ourselves, and it holds space for the other person. So I try to slow down my breath as much as I can, trying to get into that 6 in, 6 out pace. So that's my default breathing pattern. Another thing that I want people to know is how they should breathe at night. So this is something that oftentimes gets overlooked. And as we breathe at night, we should be breathing through our nose as well. About 66% of people breathe through their mouth at night. And the problem with that is that it dries out their mouth, it destroys their teeth, it keeps them in a perpetual fight or flight state, and they don't get restful sleep. So by placing a piece of mouth tape over your mouth vertically like this, it will enable people to start dreaming again. They'll wake up more refreshed. They won't have to wake up to go pee in the middle of the night. Most people will stop snoring as a result of that. And they're just going to overall improve their quality of life. So first things first, people want to slow down their breath and they want to breathe in and out through their nose as much as they can.
So just as you're falling asleep, just being super intentional with like slow, deep breaths through your nose, and that kind of like sets the program for your breathing throughout the night. Is that right?
Yeah. So the way we breathe during the day informs how we breathe at night. So the more we can slow down our breathing during the day, the slower we will breathe at night. If somebody's trying to fall asleep, then what we encourage them to do is lengthen their exhale. So you might breathe in for 6 seconds, exhale for 8 to 10 seconds. The longer we exhale, the more we relax our bodies. So anytime you want to feel more relaxed, exhale longer than you inhale, and that's going to shift gears. There's another breathing technique. I call it the parachute technique. So if you think about when you were a young kid, it's kind of a fun game that you would play with the parachute, and you'd throw the parachute up in the air and it would slowly come down. So I have people visualize that they're filling up the parachute with their breath in, and then the parachute slowly coming down as they're exhaling. So that'll help them relax and kind of melt into their bed as they go to sleep at night.
That's amazing. That's so practical for me, because like it's, even as I'm here listening, I'm doing this, and hopefully everyone else that's listening as well is like, oh wow, I'm just that presence. And I've understood a lot about the power of box breathing and why that's important, and how it like creates, it just releases, like when someone's in fight or flight, just like consciously tuning in and controlling the breath helps release, all of the hormones that are like creating stress, and it releases serotonin and oxytocin and norepinephrine, and just like helps recalibrate our nervous system. But to go beyond that, it's just like holding that presence of like, just like slowing down. And I notice even in that conversation, it's like, oh, I feel more present. I feel more connected. And I also feel more energized. I feel like more tuned in. I feel more clear. And so I really appreciate that, because I think I'm probably like most people, where I'm unconscious of my breathing the vast majority of the time. And so this conversation's been super helpful. I really appreciate that. We just have a couple minutes. I just want to wrap up by having you just share any like final encouragements or action steps, or like your message that you just want to make sure you can anchor it in for everyone that's listening.
Yeah, my philosophy is the doctor of the future is a patient, and I believe that we've been given all the gifts and tools and resources that we need to create health from the inside. So if you ever look at a tree, the tree grows from the inside. If you ever look at a flower, it grows from the inside. And I believe that breath is one of those things that allows us to grow from the inside in so many different ways. I mean, it's connected to our physical well-being, our spiritual well-being, our mental well-being. And I just feel like it's one of those things that is very easy for us to overlook. However, once we learn, and we just scratched the surface of the surface today, but once we learn how to breathe correctly, we realize there's a breath for every way we want to feel. And we have access to that at any given moment. And so every breath is literally a fork in the road to decide how we want to feel moving forward.
So powerful. And for people that want to go deeper and want to learn more about the power of intentional breathing, like where can they find you? Where can they find your work? Like give them like a key for those that really feel like, oh my gosh, it really could change my life just by simply understanding this better. What's the next step for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gerald. They can go to breathworkwithsachin.com. And I've created a whole bunch of free resources. Actually, one of my recent resources is a guide called Breathe Like This, Not That. And it tells people exactly how to breathe based on how they want to feel. So different cadences of breathing, breathing in and out through different nostrils, mouth or nose. You can literally choose how you want to feel by doing different breathing techniques. So there's a whole bunch of resources in there, keynotes, PowerPoints, breathwork sessions. So I actually have a fully recorded 75-minute breathwork that's guided that they can go through that people have profound shifts and transformations through. So that's all free and it's all available at Breathwork with Sachin.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that's Breathwork with Sachin. Sachin is Sachin. So breathworkwithsachin.com. And yeah, what a gift it is. And thank you for being a student of life. Thank you for being a seeker. I feel like the seekers are always the best mentors. And I feel my soul's like re-energized, and I have a little more. I love that I have some things to like focus on now. It's just like, just breathing, just like keeping that present. So thank you. And I'm grateful for your friendships. I'm grateful for who you are. Thank you for your commitment to just bringing wholeness and well-being to the world in all the ways that you do.
Thank you, Gerald. What an opportunity to connect with you.
Thank you so much for joining us on Psychedelic Sex and the Superconscious. Please subscribe and make sure that you catch all of our future episodes as we talk more about how to activate the higher mind. Love you guys. Just remember, this is your life. Make it legendary.